The words hit me like a slap across the face. "You'll never amount to anything, Brandon." Mrs. Caldwell's voice cut through the classroom like a knife. 28 pairs of eyes stared at me as I stood there, holding my failed math test. The red ink seemed to bleed across the paper. 34%. Not my worst grade, but apparently the final straw. "Some children are just born without the gift," she continued, her gray hair pulled back so tight it looked painful. "And Brandon here is living proof that not everyone is meant for success." The snickers started small, first from Cody in the back row, then spread like wildfire. Soon the entire 7th grade was laughing at me, at my worn-out sneakers with the hole near the toe, at my second-hand shirt that was too big, at everything that made me different. But you know what hurt the most? The way she smiled when she said it, like she actually enjoyed watching me crumble. I wanted to disappear. I wanted the floor to swallow me whole. Instead, I just stood there, my face burning with shame, clutching that test paper until my knuckles turned white. "You can sit down now," she said dismissively, already moving on to the next victim. But something happened in that moment, something she didn't see. As I walked back to my desk, past all those laughing faces, I made a promise to myself. Promise that would change everything. "I'm going to prove you wrong." The autumn air bit at my cheeks as I trudged down Maple Street. Usually, I'd take the shortcut through the park, but today I needed time to think. Time to let the anger settle into something useful. My backpack felt heavier than usual. Not because of books. We barely had any homework in Mrs. Caldwell's class because she said half of us wouldn't understand it anyway. No, it felt heavy because of the weight of what just happened. "Brandon." I turned to see my neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, watering her flowers. She was one of the few adults who always smiled at me. "How was school today, sweetheart?" I forced a smile. "Fine, Mrs. Patterson. Just fine." But it wasn't fine. Nothing about today was fine. As I reached my front door, I could hear the TV blaring inside. Mom was probably asleep on the couch again after her double shift at the diner. Dad wouldn't be home for hours. I climbed the creaky stairs to my room and shut the door. That's when I let myself feel it. Really feel it. The embarrassment. The anger. The crushing weight of being told you're not good enough. I grabbed an old composition notebook from my desk, the one I used for random thoughts, and wrote 3 words that would become my battle cry: "Prove her wrong." I underlined it 3 times. Then I stared at those words until they burned into my memory. Mrs. Caldwell thought she knew my future? She was about to find out just how wrong a teacher could be. That night changed everything. While my parents watched late-night TV downstairs, I spread my homework across my desk under the glow of my small lamp. Math had always been my weakness, but for the first time I was determined to crack the code. I started with the basics. Simple addition and subtraction that I should have mastered years ago. It was embarrassing, but I swallowed my pride. Every wrong answer was just another step toward proving Mrs. Caldwell wrong. 3 hours later, my eyes were burning and my hand was cramping, but something clicked. The numbers started making sense. Not all of them, but enough to feel like I was climbing out of a deep hole. The next morning, I woke up before my alarm. I reviewed my math homework twice, checking every answer. When I walked into Mrs. Caldwell's classroom, I felt different. Not confident exactly, but determined. "Homework out," she announced without looking up from her desk. I placed my paper on her desk with the others. She glanced at it, then looked again. For just a second, I saw surprise flicker across her face. But then her expression hardened. "Let's not get our hopes up, Brandon. One decent homework assignment doesn't change anything." But I knew better. It was changing everything. That night I studied for 4 hours, then 5, then 6. Each night, I pushed myself harder, driven by the memory of her voice saying those crushing words. My grades started creeping up. Not dramatically from failing to barely passing, but it was movement in the right direction. And with each small victory, that fire inside me burned brighter. Mrs. Caldwell noticed, but she wasn't pleased. If anything, she seemed annoyed that her prediction wasn't coming true fast enough. 3 months later, Mrs. Caldwell announced a surprise test. "This will count for 30% of your quarter grade," she said, her eyes landing on me with that familiar look of disappointment. I'd been studying every night for weeks. While other kids played video games or watched TV, I was hunched over textbooks, working through problem after problem. My parents thought I was obsessed. Maybe I was. The test was on pre-algebra stuff that supposedly separated the wheat from the chaff, according to Mrs. Caldwell. As she placed the paper on my desk, she whispered just loud enough for me to hear, "Don't disappoint yourself, Brandon." But as I read through the questions, something amazing happened. I knew the answers. Not just guessed, actually knew them. My pencil moved across the page with confidence I'd never felt before. 45 minutes later, I was done. I checked my work twice, then handed it in. Mrs. Caldwell barely glanced at me, but I caught her eyebrow raise slightly when she saw I'd finished with time to spare. The weekend dragged by. I kept replaying every question, second-guessing myself. Had I really done as well as I thought? Or was I just fooling myself? Monday morning, Mrs. Caldwell walked into class carrying a stack of graded tests. "As expected," she began, "most of you struggled with this material. Only 3 students scored above 80%. She started calling names and handing back papers. "Ashley, nice work. 92%. Ashley beamed and her friends congratulated her. "Derek, solid effort. 87%. Then silence. She stared at the remaining papers in her hand with a puzzled expression. When she called my name, the entire class went quiet. "Brandon Mitchell." Her voice was flat, emotionless. I walked to the front, my heart pounding so hard I was sure everyone could hear it. She held out my paper, but when I reached for it, she held on for just a moment too long. 96%, she said quietly. The class erupted. Not in applause, in shock. Cody actually said "no way" out loud. Ashley's mouth hung open. But what I remember most was the look on Mrs. Caldwell's face. Pure disbelief. I walked back to my seat in a daze, staring at the red 96% at the top of my paper. 96%. The highest grade I'd ever gotten on anything. But instead of congratulating me, Mrs. Caldwell cleared her throat. "Well," she said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "I suppose even a broken clock is right twice a day. Don't let one lucky test go to your head, Brandon." Lucky? Lucky? That's when I realized something important. This wasn't just about proving myself anymore. This was war. Everything changed when Mr. Harrison became our substitute teacher. Mrs. Caldwell had been out for 2 weeks with what the principal called a family emergency. And honestly, the classroom felt lighter without her constant negativity. Mr. Harrison was different from any teacher I'd ever had. Young, probably in his late 20s, with kind eyes and a smile that seemed genuine. He actually listened when students asked questions instead of making them feel stupid. "Math isn't about being naturally smart," he told our class on his first day. "It's about persistence. Anyone can master this stuff if they're willing to put in the work." I stayed after class that first day, pretending to organize my backpack while the other students filed out. When we were alone, Mr. Harrison approached my desk. "Brandon, right?" He pulled up a chair. "I've been looking at your recent work. Impressive improvement." "Thanks," I mumbled, not used to praise from teachers. "What changed?" he asked. "Your grades from the beginning of the year compared to now. It's like looking at 2 different students." I hesitated. How do you tell someone that you're studying obsessively because a teacher told you you'd never amount to anything? That every night, you fall asleep to the sound of her voice, saying you don't have the gift? "I just decided I wanted to be better," I said finally. Mr. Harrison nodded slowly. "You know what I see when I look at your work? Grit. That's rarer than natural talent, Brandon. Talent without work ethic fails. But grit can take you anywhere." For the next 2 weeks, he stayed after school to help me with advanced problems. Not because I was failing, my grades were solid B's now, but because he saw potential that no other teacher had bothered to look for. "Have you thought about taking advanced math next year?" he asked during one of our sessions. I almost laughed. Mrs. Caldwell says I'm not advanced material. Mrs. Caldwell is wrong. His voice was firm. I've taught hundreds of students, Brandon. You have something special. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise. When Mrs. Caldwell returned, she seemed annoyed that Mr. Harrison had disrupted her classroom dynamic. But the damage was done in the best possible way. For the first time in my life, an authority figure believed in me. That belief became fuel for the fire that was already burning inside me. College was brutal. Not just academically. I'd gotten used to that challenge and actually thrived on it. No, the hardest part was being surrounded by kids who'd never worried about money, never worked nights to pay for textbooks, never eaten ramen for dinner 5 nights in a row. But I had something they didn't: hunger. While my roommate Jeremy complained about his parents cutting his allowance to $300 a week, I was working 20-hour shifts at the campus coffee shop and pulling all-nighters to keep my grades up. The breakthrough came during my junior year. I was working late in the computer lab, debugging code for my programming class, when Professor Williams stopped by my workstation. "Still here, Brandon? It's past midnight. Just trying to get this algorithm right," I said, rubbing my tired eyes. "It's due tomorrow and I can't figure out why it keeps crashing." She looked at my code for a few minutes, then sat down next to me. "You're approaching this wrong. You're trying to brute force the solution. Sometimes the elegant answer is simpler than you think." She showed me a different approach, cleaner, more efficient. In 20 minutes, she helped me solve what I'd been struggling with for 6 hours. "You have good instincts," she said as we packed up, "but you're too hard on yourself. Confidence is part of programming too." A week later, she approached me after class. "Brandon, I'm working on a project with a local startup. They need a part-time programmer. Interested?" My heart stopped. A real programming job? Not serving coffee or stocking shelves, but actual work in my field? "The pay isn't much," she continued. $15 an hour, maybe 20 hours a week. But the experience would be invaluable. $15 an hour sounded like a fortune to someone who'd been making minimum wage. But more than the money, this felt like validation. Someone thought my skills were worth paying for. The startup was called TechFlow Solutions. Just 4 people crammed into a converted garage, working on inventory management software for small businesses. Nothing glamorous, but to me it felt like Google. My boss, a guy named Connor who was only 3 years older than me, looked over my first week's work and nodded approvingly. "Clean code," he said. "You're going to do well in this industry, Brandon. You've got the work ethic that separates the good programmers from the great ones." That night, I called home for the first time in weeks. When Mom asked how school was going, I couldn't keep the excitement out of my voice. "I got a job, Mom. A real programming job. They're paying me to write code." "That's wonderful, honey," she said, and I could hear the pride in her voice. "Your father and I are so proud of how hard you've worked." As I hung up the phone, I thought about Mrs. Caldwell for the first time in months. If she could see me now, getting paid to do something she'd convinced me I wasn't smart enough for, what would she say? Probably find some way to diminish it. "It's just a small job, Brandon. Don't let it go to your head." But her voice in my memory didn't sting anymore. If anything, it motivated me. This was just the beginning. 5 years later, I was ready to bet everything on myself. My startup, FlowLogic, was supposed to revolutionize how small businesses managed their inventory. I'd scraped together $50,000, my life savings, plus loans I wasn't sure I could repay, to build the minimum viable product. The first 6 months were a nightmare. 18-hour days, countless rejections, and slowly watching my bank account drain toward zero. I was living on instant mac and cheese again, just like college, except now I was 27 and had real responsibilities. "You should get a regular job," my girlfriend Kelsey said during one of our increasingly frequent fights. "This startup thing isn't working, Brandon. You're going to lose everything." Maybe she was right. I'd pitched to 43 investors and gotten 43 rejections. The polite ones said my idea was interesting but not scalable. The harsh ones just said no. The breaking point came on a Tuesday in November. I was down to my last $800 when I got an email from the final investor on my list, Angela Reeves from Venture Point Capital. Thanks for your presentation, but we're going to pass. Your product lacks the innovation factor we look for. Best of luck. I stared at that email for 20 minutes. $800 left. Rent due in 2 weeks. 3 maxed out credit cards. And apparently a product that lacked innovation. That night, I sat in my empty apartment and seriously considered giving up. Maybe Mrs. Caldwell had been right all along. Maybe I wasn't meant for success. Maybe I should just find a regular job and stop pretending I could build something important. But then I remembered Mr. Harrison's words. Grit can take you anywhere. And Professor Williams, confidence is part of programming too. I opened my laptop and started making a list. Not of reasons to quit, but of ways to improve. Maybe my product wasn't innovative enough. Fine, I'd make it better. I spent the next 3 weeks rebuilding FlowLogic from scratch. New features, better user interface, more powerful analytics. I used the last of my money to attend a trade show in Austin, setting up a tiny booth between 2 established companies. On the second day, a woman in a business suit stopped by my booth. She seemed genuinely interested in the demo, asking detailed questions about the back-end architecture and data security. This is impressive, she said finally. How long have you been working on this? 2 years, I said, trying to sound confident despite my rumbling stomach. She handed me her card. I'm Patricia Novak from Streamline Ventures. We specialize in B2B software investments. I'd like to set up a meeting to discuss funding. My hands were shaking as I took her card. I'd love that. 3 weeks later, I walked out of their office with a check for $200,000 and a partnership deal that would change everything. As I sat in my car in their parking lot, staring at that check, I thought about every person who'd believed in me along the way, and every person who hadn't. Mrs. Caldwell's voice echoed in my memory. You'll never amount to anything. I smiled and started the car. She was about to find out just how wrong she'd been. 20 years later, I stood in the same auditorium where Mrs. Caldwell had once humiliated me. The irony wasn't lost on me. Westfield Middle School was hosting their 50th anniversary celebration, and somehow, I'd become the guest of honor. FlowLogic had grown beyond my wildest dreams. We'd been acquired by Microsoft for $200 million, and I'd gone on to found 2 more successful companies. Forbes had called me one of tech's most inspiring success stories. But success wasn't why I was here. I was here because of a letter I'd received 6 months earlier. Dear Mr. Mitchell, it had started. You may not remember me, but I'm the principal of Westfield Middle School, where you attended 7th grade. We're planning our anniversary celebration and would be honored if you'd speak to our students about perseverance and success. Of course, I remembered. I remembered everything about that place. The hallways where kids had laughed at me. The classroom where I'd been told I'd never amount to anything. The very auditorium where I now stood. What the principal didn't know was that Mrs. Caldwell still taught there. At 71, she was supposedly planning to retire at the end of the school year. The thought of facing her again had kept me awake for weeks. Ladies and gentlemen, Principal Watson announced, please welcome our distinguished guest speaker, Brandon Mitchell, CEO of Mitchell Technologies. The applause was warm and genuine. I looked out at the crowd, current students, teachers, parents, and former classmates who'd made the trip back. And there, in the 3rd row, sat Mrs. Caldwell. She looked older, obviously, grayer, more fragile, but her eyes held the same critical sharpness I remembered. I started my speech with the usual pleasantries, talking about the importance of education and following your dreams. But then I shifted gears. I want to tell you about my 7th grade year, I said, because that year changed my life in ways I never could have imagined. I told them about the failed math test, about being told I'd never amount to anything, about the laughter and the shame and the crushing weight of adult expectations. The auditorium grew quiet. Some students shifted uncomfortably. I saw Mrs. Caldwell's face grow pale. That teacher was wrong about me, I continued. But in a way, I'm grateful she said what she did, because her words lit a fire in me that has burned for over 20 years. Every achievement, every success, every moment of triumph. They all started with that moment of humiliation. I paused and looked directly at Mrs. Caldwell. Which brings me to why I'm really here tonight. Westfield Middle School shaped who I became, even if it wasn't in the way anyone expected. And I want to give back to the students who need it most, the ones who've been told they're not smart enough, not talented enough, not worth investing in. Principal Watson stepped forward with a microphone, clearly expecting me to announce a small donation. "I'm establishing the Westfield Second Chances Scholarship Fund," I announced, with an initial endowment of $5 million. The auditorium erupted. Students cheered. Parents applauded. Teachers wiped away tears. But I wasn't done. This fund will provide full college scholarships to students who've struggled academically, but show determination to improve. Because sometimes the kids who get written off are the ones with the most to prove. As the applause died down, I looked once more at Mrs. Caldwell. She was staring at me with an expression I'd never seen before, something between regret and amazement. After my speech, she approached me near the exit. "Brandon," she said quietly, I owe you an apology. For 20 years, I'd imagined this moment. I'd rehearsed what I'd say, how I'd make her feel as small as she'd made me feel. But now, looking at this elderly woman with tears in her eyes, all I felt was peace. "You don't owe me anything, Mrs. Caldwell," I said. "You gave me exactly what I needed, a reason to prove you wrong." She nodded slowly. "You certainly did that." As I walked to my car that night, I thought about the 7th grader who'd walked these same hallways 20 years ago. Broken, humiliated, but somehow undefeated. Mrs. Caldwell had been wrong about a lot of things, but she'd been right about one. That moment in her classroom really did change everything. Just not in the way she expected.
If this story got you thinking, go ahead and hit that like button. Don't forget to subscribe for more real stories that hit deep, and tap the bell so you don't miss what's coming next. And hey, if you know someone who needs to hear this one, share it with them. Thanks for watching.